For those of us invested in the long-running story arc of Tekken, Tekken 8's Dark Awakens, that has been teased across both the demo and several trailers, is building to be the most climactic chapter in the series to date, I think. The closure of Heihachi's chapter as the domineering patriarch of the Mishima clan and the Mishima Zaibotsu, which had seen him feature in every entry of the series to date, has now narrowed the field of the family feud in Tekken 8 to focus on the next generation, the lingering feud between the estranged father and son, Jin Kazama and Kazuya Mishima, both of whom are able to harness the power of the Devil Gene. This in and of itself has elevated Tekken 8 to new levels and high stakes, with the trailer footage of two devils destroying skyscrapers and smashing apart a city as they battle one another being reminiscent of the apocalyptic Japanese kaiju movies like Godzilla, or indeed the Marvel movies, which likewise show the Avengers blowing up half of New York City to defeat the villains. And really, this isn't an unreasonable comparison to make, because the last couple of Tekken games have shown broad alliances form along the lines of the Mishima feud, with the close of Tekken 7 showing the alignment of Lars, Lee and Jin in particular coming face to face and coming together to face down Kazuya and G-Corp. So there's definitely a super team vibe going on as we come into Tekken 8, and what is anticipated as the closing chapter of the Mishima blood feud. And this is amplified, I think, by the teaser trailers that show, for example, Hororang, Xiaoyu and King fighting off a legion of Jacks, and several other scenes of major characters interacting with one another, which is great, because I think for the first time in a long time, it seems that each character in the game and in the roster has a stake and inclusion in the main story, whether that's Leroy or Feng or Xiaoyu or Steve or whoever, and where Tekken was originally a bunch of fighters entering the tournament for their own personal purposes, for their own ends, it seems to have become much more of a collective fight, aligning on one side or another of this Mishima feud and becoming relevant in the story. And they did sort of attempt this in Tekken 6, which was met with mixed reception, which was that scenario campaign mode, but it seems much more cohesive in what we've seen in Tekken 8 so far. What the Tekken 8 entry also does is return to a mood and an atmosphere that Tekken originally had, but was quite lost in the middling games, I think, which is this quite dark and serious battle for the soul between light and dark, and that sort of thing, that always hinged around Kazuya, particularly in Tekken 2, and latterly in Jin Kazama from Tekken 3 and beyond. And seeing Kazuya now at his most unhinged and his most perpetually sort of devil self, it's resulted in perhaps the best announcement for an Iron Fist tournament to take place in the game, probably since about Tekken 3, where Kazuya has now thrown down the gauntlet to fighters around the world, calling on them to represent not just themselves and their prowess, but also their countries under threat of global destruction. And as he does so, we see him wreaking havoc on the world, on the developed world, destroying satellites and stuff like that. So we might assume here that he is actually throwing technology, communications and modern security back towards the Dark Ages. And I really love this because, firstly, not only does it lean into and acknowledge the international nature of our fighters by acknowledging them and their countries respectively, which has never really been drawn attention to in the story, but most importantly, it has raised the stakes to apocalyptic levels, world-endangering levels, with Kazuya destroying all of these technologies, rendering defences and weapons and security sort of redundant. And he alludes to this in his monologue, that the world has become weak, and thus he's returned to the world to a place where combat and martial prowess, the necessity of fighting, is once again of importance. And so our Tekken characters, who are the best fighters in the world, have elevated in importance from mere combatants who are after prize money to these Marvel-like superheroes that I alluded to earlier. So really strong start, solid opening for Tekken 8 here. Now, coming on to the potential twists and turns of story, we see Jin quite quickly defeated by Kazuya at the beginning of the game, and as he sinks beneath this pool of water, he rejects his devil self and is instead bathed in light and confronted with flashbacks of his mother, Jun Kazama. And I mentioned this in a few Tekken episodes I did a while back around Jun and around the Devil Gene and stuff like that. And it considers where this story might be heading and what her re-inclusion in the game, whether in person or in spirit, is really setting up. And I'm leaning towards, and I think many are leaning towards, this potential redemption arc and closure, not just for Jin, but also potentially, and most importantly, I think, for Kazuya too. And I think the symbolic breaking of the chains that is the design mark and the symbol of Tekken 8 sort of hints at the departure from not just the fated devil gene that is perpetuating down from Kazumi's line, but also this seemingly endless cycle of Mishima sons killing their fathers and vice versa, and this custom that is seemingly perpetuated down since ancient times. And the clearest hint of this yet, excusing Jun, is that in one of the cutscenes we see this historic montage of the Mishima Zaibotsu building from ancient and feudal origins into the arms-supplying giant that it later became. And there's a wealth of things to consider here if we sort of pay attention to the imagery, and most notably for me is the image of a samurai fighting a demon in one of these ancient scrolls. And this makes me think that maybe they're going to return to this Tekken 2 angle, where the devil eventually becomes an external being again. I can see a redemption arc where Jin and perhaps Kazuya are exorcised and confronted with this thing as an external entity by the end. And this remains to be seen, but I think also by showing this long lineage of the Mishimas and the establishment of the Zaibotsu, they are hinting at this break with fate that could well mean the end of the Mishima line as well, and thus the death of Kazuya, if indeed we consider Jin a Kazama as he considers himself. So there's a lot to consider here, and I think there's a lot being built up that's going to make this a really solid, conclusive story. Now, finally, we need to, of course, consider other factors that influence the Mishima bloodline and the roles that they may play in the story. And this is, of course, the external family members that seem to populate and make up this game through Heihachi's debauchery. And I think although Lars was built up through Tekken 6 as a sort of major character and as one of Heihachi's other illegitimate children, he seems to have quite firmly been relegated to this supporting role along with Li Chaolan, leading the faction against G-Corp. And I think that sort of works for him. I think he's important in his own right in that sort of global collective effort rather than the personal bloodline feud. We also have Asuka Kazama, and she's been on the sidelines for a long time, I think. If I remember, she was introduced in Tekken 5, and I think she was simply an example of Namco trying to maintain a legacy moveset by hybridizing Jun Kazama's style, for example, and modernising that. Though whether she's going to have any further major input on the story, and the core story, remains to be seen. And beyond that, we now of course have Reina being debuted in Tekken 8, who has been teased as a Mishima, or at least having adopted a Mishima fighting style. And many have supposed that she is yet another child of Heihachi. I'm not sure whether that's been confirmed. So, personally, if she is another illegitimate child of Heihachi, I think that's simply another means to preserve his fighting style and carry that across into a new game. Or, if she really is narratively pertinent, I think it might be an interesting twist if she were, in fact, another child of Kazuya instead. You know, again, bringing this down to the next generation, it would tie her in closer with the immediate story of Kazuya and Jin and give her more of a stake there. But again, as yet, nothing is confirmed, and her role sort of remains to be seen. So, the personal impressions of the Tekken 8 story are really strong at the moment. I think the series got a bit woolly in terms of core story in the middling games, particularly Tekken 6, but now having narrowed it back down to father and son, narrowing it down to this essential battle between light and dark, Jun and Kazuya, the potential for redemption with Jin being stuck in the middle, it's a great setup for a conclusive and quite dramatic episode in Tekken, or at least the Mishima's combative saga. I really think going down the road of trying to save Kazuya, even if he dies in the end, in an act of salvation or whatever, I think that would be a solid way to go with this game, and it's certainly leaning towards it from what we've seen so far.